Afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome James Siddle to KYRA Connect this afternoon. I first met James 11 years ago at the Future Leaders programme, which was led by John West-Burnham. Both James and I came from other sectors and later to teaching in life. And shortly after Future Leaders, we both began our roles as heads. So James became head at St Margarets Church of England Primary School in Withern, and I became head of Toynton. Our paths continue to cross over the years through collaboration with KYRA. And today James's role is shared. He has a continued passion and joy, using his words, a privilege to hold a post in leadership at the primary school. And he's also director of the KYRA Research School. So James, it's lovely to be with you today. I'm really keen for our partners, our KYRA partners, to know a little bit more about the research school, what it's doing and your involvement with that. So I was wondering if we could start by you telling me how the KYRA Research School began and what inspired you to become involved.
Yeah, I think, thank you. It's really nice being here for a start. Yeah, I think it's still slightly a kind of enigmatic kind of organisation that kind of sits there. What does it do? So I think that the first thing is to make the connection with the funders. So it's funded by the Education Endowment Foundation, and I think almost all heads will know the EEF, whether it's being that they refer to the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, or whether they've been part of an EEF trial, or they use the guidance reports, for example. So we kind of sit in a kind of backdrop with all that, and are very much part of that organisation. Initially, it was actually a partnership back in 2016, also with York University. And I suppose that the core purpose is for us to act as a conduit, as a bridge between the academic, the research, what the research says are the kind of best bets. If I want to solve a problem in my school, what are the best bets pedagogically? What should I do? And how that translates, how it translates into a school like our schools, a small rural school, or if it was a large urban school, for example, what might work here and what might work there, what's the best bets, rather than going and you often have this kind of confusing kind of array of options. Where do we focus on feedback? Do we reduce the size of classes, etc.? To make those decisions. Part of what we do is to help work with heads to make those kind of informed decisions. I always think a classic example of that was many years ago in California, in the States. One of the things that they decided to do to improve school outcomes was to reduce class sizes. And they spent over $1 billion employing new teachers and reducing the class size. And it had absolutely no impact whatsoever. And in fact, actually, standards dropped for a while as well. And it's interesting, the research on class size says it doesn't make any difference until you get below numbers like 15. So actually, what they've done is invest a huge amount of money and not looked into the research, and the consequence was that money was wasted. And I suppose that we make those kind of decisions on a more micro level for our schools, for our children all the time. And it's making those decisions that we can hopefully best have an impact on them. I said in terms of the next part of the question was how did I kind of get involved, and actually you kind of referred to part of it, which was that course, that Future Leaders course that we were on all those years ago. And I can still remember that we were sat, I think it was in Woodall Spa, wasn't it? It was the Petworth Hotel.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
And we were sat there, and John West-Burnham said there's this toolkit, and in the toolkit he talked about teaching assistants, and I don't know if you remember this. And he said that teaching assistants have no impact. And I sat there and I was fuming. And he described, and he put the toolkit up, and he described what there was a description of what TAs do. And part of that description was they put displays up and things like that. And I just thought, they don't in my school. They're actually used for purposeful interventions. I've got some brilliant teaching assistants. And I just thought, well, actually, if they're saying that this is what teaching assistants do, and most of us know actually that's not what they do, actually it's undermining the message. And I just didn't believe it. So what I did was I went home after that, and I looked up the author of the toolkit, and I emailed him, which was Professor Steve Higgins at Durham University. And I said, well, this is your description. This is not what RTAs do. And the impact seems to be, not what I would expect, because we use interventions all the time and we see a positive impact. And Steve is brilliant, and he sent me a huge email next day, a rather academic email, and I was like, oh, Lord, get my head around all this academic jargon. But I just thought, well, at least he's engaging with me. And I said, well, actually, as a head teacher, I've switched off to what you told me because of your description. And it was one at the time, my tiny contribution to the toolkit was they reworded it a little bit off the bat of the conversations. But that, for me, started a conversation with Steve. And I said about interventions, about the roles of TAs, and about the roles of research generally. And Steve was a font of knowledge, and I regularly email him, and he'd say, well, actually, look at this, read this paper. And I'd be like, oh, this is fascinating. Because I suppose I was interested in how do we get better? I was in a school at that time that was getting better, but what was the pathway for us to get better quicker and to do it more efficiently? And what I was doing at the time was actually picking out the top 5 schools in the league tables and going and visiting them in my own time and finding out, well, what practice is it? And a lot of the time it just seemed to be driven by SATs, driven by those kind of normative pressures, which didn't seem right to me, and driven by the loudest voice in the classroom sometimes. And that didn't seem right to me either. I wanted a conversation about what evidence would suggest rather than just guessing. And I suppose that's kind of what led me down a pathway to being more involved in evidence-based practice, ultimately to do the best for the children.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. So I guess my next question is to talk a little bit about what the KYRA Research School looks like today and about the projects that the Research School is currently involved in, because I think that that's something that KYRA leaders might not know so much about.
Yeah, and I think... And we're involved in a fascinating array of things. Everything from working with schools in Lithuania at the moment to working on reading projects and everything kind of in between. I suppose, if I was a school leader and, if I had an uncertainty about something like feedback, let's talk about, think of the teaching learning toolkit, and it has all these elements in it that it kind of points towards, that research suggests. At the top, there are things like metacognition and self-regulated learning and feedback, cooperative learning. If I was a head and I was thinking, well, I wanted to investigate feedback, where do I go? That would be part of our role. Just phone us up, send us an email. Where do I go for the research in this? I'm fascinated by feedback. The evidence suggests, for example, there are 8 psychological reactions to feedback, 6 of them are negative. Like overpraising children, or children that have done well in the terms of attainment, but actually haven't worked hard. And we say things like, well done, because you've answered the question correctly. And then they correspondingly think, well, actually, I don't have to bother working hard because I've just been told, well done. So, that kind of nuance of evidence, if you want some research, if you want an overview, then we operate at that level. And that can just be a few emails just for us to flag up where to go, what it might look like in practice. In terms of projects, I think we're involved with about 40-50 schools at the moment in terms of an improving reading project, primarily at Key Stage 2, where we look at things like reciprocal approaches to reading, repeated reading, reading fluency, reading volume, what are those things that make a difference in schools. We might flag up certain interventions that are evidence-based, like a lot of heads wouldn't have heard of abracadabra, for example, which is a year 1 intervention. Which is a fascinating intervention developed by Concordia University in Canada. And I mean, this is the kind of thing that I'd want to know as a head. So mentioning Steve Higgins in the past, Steve Higgins talks about interventions like a balloon. He says you put an intervention in for a child and you squeeze the balloon and it goes into one shape, and then you pull it out and you take your hand away and it just goes back into the shape before. And that I think would resonate with a lot of heads. We intervene, take them out again, and it's like they need to go back again. And ABRA is a really interesting one because there's a longitudinal study that after it was inputted for 20 weeks, when they came back a year later, they could still feel the effect. And a lot of interventions don't do that. It had that longitudinal impact on people's outcomes in terms of reading, comprehension, and decoding. So again, we can flag up things like that. The reading projects that I mentioned. We're setting up an evidence hub in the north and northeast of Lincs at the moment, which replicates what we're doing. We have what we call ELEs. Most people won't have heard of an ELE, they would have heard of SLEs, which is pretty much the same, but we are evidence leads. So we train up, we've got 40 of them at the moment. We train them up to have a knowledge of evidence and what the evidence suggests would work. And then they can work with schools. We extend almost all the way down into North London. Now we have an associate research school in Leicestershire, so our work is beyond just Lincolnshire now. And we do other things, evaluation in particular. We do a lot of trials, like randomised control trials, and work with schools in terms of evaluation. And we are currently evaluating the new curriculum in Lithuania. So that's one job that we're doing. They're implementing a new curriculum. Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We are the evaluators for that. So it's a fascinating job working with the Lithuanian government, with the British Council, evaluating that. So a whole range of projects. But I suppose for leaders, certainly within Lincolnshire, etc., it would be that what works, what could potentially work, what does the evidence suggest would work.
Yes, brilliant. And having spoken to Juliet recently about the Lithuanian project, I think it's that whole sort of blue sky thinking, in that there isn't a blueprint for them to follow. It's that sort of level of horizon gazing, which is really fascinating. I think that would be lessons learned, which would be really useful for our KYRA leaders.
Yeah, absolutely.
So lastly, James, and thank you for sharing that with us so far. What's the vision for the future for the research school, and how can our KYRA schools and leaders get involved?
So there's always professional development that we do, and I think there's a particular interest, because I think we offer things that perhaps others aren't, and I only mean that from, again, all our professional development is evidence-based. It's all out there. So, for example, if you look on the Research School website, and there are things like curriculum design and metacognition and self-regulation. They're often included in other elements, but actually we do some evidence-based professional development on that. We also help with, rather than it just being, okay, I'll send my teacher off in a traditional kind of way, we'll go out for a 3-day course. We actually discuss what, and part of all the training that we do is that we talk about implementation and evaluation. So we talk about, for example, instructional coaching and what it looks like, and what the evidence suggests, and various other forms of it. So there are various elements of professional development that you can get involved in. As mentioned already, you can just email us and ask us more about evidence, etc., and flag that up. If you wanted somebody to come in and help with a particular project, like if you're doing something with your development plan, if you're doing it on a particular area like reading, and say we've got 40 ELEs at our disposal, who are all kind of very knowledgeable and well trained. We've got wider access to the EF. I was on a phone call yesterday with Rob Coe, from Professor Rob Coe, etc., and Alex Quigley. So we have access to the wider network, which schools can benefit from at all. So just get in touch with us. The website's there. Just Google us, and we'll be very, very willing and able to hopefully to listen.
Brilliant. Well, it's been an absolute joy chatting with you this afternoon. Lovely to catch up. I hope very much to bump into you again in the near future. And thank you so much for your time today. It's clearly evident that your passion for research, and also passion remaining as your role as a head teacher, is absolutely continuing forward with you. And thank you so much for sharing your insight this afternoon.
No problem. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, Lesley.
Bye.